The sterile white of the hospital room was blinding, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. Every beep of the heart monitor was a countdown, each rhythmic pulse a hammer against the anvil of her resolve. Her husband, the man who had vowed to protect her, stood silhouetted against the window, his voice a cold blade carving out the last of her dignity. "You will apologize," he'd said, not as a request, but as a decree. Apologize to the woman who was trying to shatter her world. He didn't know the truth, the secret she clutched tighter than the crisp hospital sheets, a secret that, once revealed, would bring his gilded empire crashing down around him. The penthouse was a marvel of modern architecture, a glass box suspended 50 stories above the sprawling city. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view that most people only dreamed of, a glittering tapestry of lights that stretched to the horizon. But for the woman who lived there, it was a cage, albeit a beautifully gilded one. For 7 months, her world had been confined to these opulent walls, her life a carefully curated performance for an audience of one. Her husband. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, a titan of industry whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear. He had given her everything she could ever want: couture gowns, priceless jewels, a life of unimaginable luxury. But he had taken something far more valuable in return: her freedom. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the people she spoke to. Her phone was a direct line to him, her social media accounts a gallery of their perfect life, each post a carefully crafted lie. Tonight, the lie was wearing thin. She stood before the expansive window, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the city lights. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly, a silent promise to the life growing within her. This child, her child, would not grow up in a cage. She had to find a way out, a way to break free from the invisible bars that held her captive. Her husband was in his study, the low murmur of his voice audible through the thick oak door. He was on a business call, sealing a deal that would add another 0 to his already staggering net worth. He was a master negotiator, a man who always got what he wanted. But he had underestimated her, mistaken her quiet compliance for weakness. He didn't know about the secret she carried, a secret that had the power to unravel his carefully constructed world. She had stumbled upon it by accident, a series of encrypted emails she was never meant to see. At first, she hadn't understood their significance, the cryptic references and coded language. But as she delved deeper, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Her husband, the man she had once loved, was not just a ruthless businessman. He was a criminal, his vast fortune built on a foundation of deceit and corruption. The knowledge had been a heavy burden, a secret that festered in the silence of her gilded cage. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, meticulously documenting his crimes, every piece of information a potential key to her freedom. But it was a dangerous game she was playing. If he ever found out, there was no telling what he would do. He was a man who did not tolerate betrayal, and she was betraying him in the most profound way imaginable. A sudden wave of nausea washed over her, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. The stress of her situation was taking its toll, her body a battleground of fear and determination. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her unborn child. She would not let her son or daughter be born into a world of lies and corruption. The study door opened, and her husband emerged, a triumphant smile on his face. "The deal is done," he announced, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. He strode over to the bar and poured himself a celebratory glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glowing in the soft light of the penthouse. He turned to her, his smile faltering as he took in her pale face and troubled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone shifting from celebratory to suspicious. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She forced a smile, her acting skills honed by years of practice. "Just a little tired, that's all," she lied, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. "Pregnancy, you know." He seemed to accept her explanation, his attention already shifting back to his own success. He was a man consumed by his own ambition, his ego a bottomless pit that could never be filled. He saw her not as a partner, but as a possession, another beautiful object to adorn his perfect life. As he launched into a detailed account of his business triumph, her mind drifted back to the emails, to the cold, hard evidence of his crimes. She had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not only her future, but the future of her child. She could stay, continue to play the part of the devoted wife, and raise her child in a world of luxury and lies. Or she could risk everything, expose her husband's crimes, and fight for a life of freedom and truth. The choice was clear. She would not be a prisoner in her own life, a silent accomplice to his corruption. She would fight, not with weapons or brute force, but with the one thing he could not control, the truth. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, but she was not afraid. She had something to fight for, a reason to be brave. She had a child to protect, a future to build, and she would not let anyone, not even the most powerful man in the city, stand in her way. The charity gala was the social event of the season, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. The air hummed with the chatter of the city's elite, a symphony of clinking champagne glasses and discreetly murmured gossip. She moved through the crowd like a phantom, her designer gown a shimmering armor against the prying eyes and insincere smiles. Her husband was by her side, his hand a possessive weight on the small of her back, guiding her through the throngs of people who clamored for a moment of his attention. He was in his element, a king holding court in his lavish kingdom. He reveled in the admiration, the envy, the sycophantic laughter that followed his every joke. She played her part to perfection, the adoring wife, the perfect accessory to his power. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, a storm of emotions was raging. Every smile was a lie, every polite nod a betrayal of her own conscience. Her plan was in motion, a carefully orchestrated series of events that would culminate in her husband's downfall. She had anonymously leaked the first set of documents to a trusted journalist, a woman known for her tenacity and unwavering commitment to the truth. The story was set to break in the morning, a bombshell that would rock the city's financial world to its core. But her plan had a fatal flaw, a variable she hadn't accounted for. As she and her husband made their way to their table, a woman approached them, her smile as sharp as a shard of glass. She was beautiful, in a cold, predatory way, her eyes locking onto her husband with an intimacy that sent a chill down her spine. "Darling," the woman purred, her voice a low, seductive drawl. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to show." Her husband's smile tightened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied, his voice a little too smooth, a little too charming. The woman's gaze shifted to her, her eyes raking over her pregnant belly with a look of undisguised contempt. "And this must be the little woman," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I've heard so much about you." She felt a surge of anger, a protective instinct rising up within her. She opened her mouth to speak, but her husband's grip on her back tightened, a silent warning to stay quiet. "This is my wife," he said, his voice firm, a subtle emphasis on the word wife. The woman's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Of course," she said, her eyes still fixed on her. How silly of me. The encounter was brief, but it left her shaken. The woman's proprietary air, the possessive way she looked at her husband, the undisguised hostility in her eyes, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. This was his mistress. The rest of the evening was a blur. She went through the motions, smiling, nodding, laughing at all the right moments, but her mind was in a turmoil. The existence of a mistress changed everything. It added a new layer of betrayal to her husband's already long list of transgressions. It made her fight for freedom even more urgent, even more necessary. As the gala drew to a close, her husband cornered her in the powder room, his face a mask of cold fury. "What was that all about?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "What was what about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't play dumb with me," he hissed, his eyes boring into hers. "You were rude to her. You embarrassed me." "I was rude," she retorted, her voice rising in disbelief. She was the one who was rude, who looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off the bottom of her shoe. "You will not speak to her like that," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You will not speak about her at all." "Why?" she challenged, her fear giving way to a reckless courage. "Because she's your mistress?" The slap came out of nowhere, a sharp, stinging blow that sent her staggering back against the cold marble of the sink. She raised a hand to her cheek, the skin already red and throbbing. The shock of the blow was quickly replaced by a cold, hard certainty. There was no going back. There was no salvaging this marriage, no hope for a future together. There was only escape. "You will never speak of this again," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Do you understand me?" She looked at him, at the man she had once loved, and saw a stranger, a monster who wore a human face. She saw a man who was capable of anything, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I understand." But as he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the cold, sterile silence of the powder room, she knew that she had lied. She would speak of this. She would speak of all of it. And when she was done, the whole world would know the truth about the man she had married. The king was about to be dethroned, and she would be the one to light the match that would burn his kingdom to the ground. The morning after the gala, the penthouse felt more like a prison than ever before. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a heavy silence that was more suffocating than any argument. Her husband had left early, without a word, the only evidence of his presence, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the bedside table. The red mark on her cheek had faded to a dull, throbbing ache, a physical manifestation of the emotional wound he had inflicted. She spent the morning on edge, her nerves frayed, every sound making her jump. She kept checking her phone, waiting for the news to break, for the first tremor of the earthquake she had set in motion. But the hours ticked by, and there was nothing. The silence from the journalist was deafening, a worrying sign that something had gone wrong. Around noon, her husband returned, his face a thunderous mask. He stormed into the living room, his eyes blazing with a cold, calculated fury. He was holding a tablet, the screen displaying the article she had been so desperately waiting for. But it wasn't the explosive exposé she had envisioned. It was a watered-down, heavily redacted version of the truth, her husband's crimes reduced to vague allegations and unsubstantiated rumors. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Did you really think you could betray me and get away with it?" She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. He knew. He knew she was the one who had leaked the documents. Her carefully constructed plan had crumbled to dust, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her voice a weak, unconvincing whisper. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed through the silent penthouse. "Don't insult my intelligence," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I know it was you, and now you're going to fix it." "Fix it?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "How can I fix it?" "You're going to issue a public statement," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You're going to say that you were the source of the leak, that you acted out of jealousy and spite, that you fabricated the entire story to get back at me for my indiscretion." She stared at him, horrified. He wanted her to take the fall, to sacrifice her own reputation, to save his. He wanted her to become the villain in his story, the crazy, vindictive wife who would stop at nothing to destroy her husband. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't do it. You don't have a choice," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "If you don't do as I say, I will make your life a living hell. I will take your child from you. I will make sure you never see him or her again. You will be left with nothing. Do you understand me?" Nothing. The threat hung in the air between them, a cold, sharp blade pressed against her throat. He knew her weakness, the one thing she would do anything to protect. Her child. The thought of losing her baby was a pain so sharp, so visceral, it took her breath away. "And that's not all," he continued, his voice relentless. "You're going to apologize to her." "Apologize to who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "To my friend," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You were rude to her at the gala. You embarrassed me. You will go to her, and you will apologize for your behavior." The humiliation of it was a bitter pill to swallow. He wanted her to grovel at the feet of his mistress, to beg for forgiveness from the woman who was trying to destroy her marriage. It was a power play, a calculated move to break her spirit, to crush her will to fight. She looked at him, at the cold, unfeeling man who stood before her, and she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt before. Not fear, not anger, but a cold, hard resolve. He had underestimated her. He had mistaken her love for her child as a weakness, but it was her greatest strength. It was the fire that fueled her determination, the anchor that kept her from being swept away by the storm of his rage. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll do it." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to fight, to argue, to break down in tears. He had not expected this quiet, unnerving compliance. "I'll do it," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "But I have one condition." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what's that?" "I want it in writing," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I want a post-nuptial agreement that guarantees my financial independence and full custody of our child, no matter what happens between us." He stared at her, his mind reeling. She had turned the tables on him, using his own tactics against him. She had found a way to leverage her situation, to turn her weakness into a weapon. For a long moment, he was silent, his mind weighing the options. He could refuse, of course. He could follow through on his threats, drag her through a messy, public divorce, and fight for custody of their child. But he was a man who valued his reputation above all else. A public scandal was the last thing he wanted. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped and resentful. "You'll have your agreement, but don't think for a second that this changes anything. You're still mine, and you will do as I say." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I understand," she said. But as he turned and walked away, a sense of triumph, cold and sharp, washed over her. He had won the battle, but he had not won the war. He had given her the one thing she needed to secure her freedom, a legally binding document that would protect her and her child. He had unwittingly handed her the key to her gilded cage, and now all she had to do was find the courage to use it. The address he gave her was for a chic, minimalist apartment in a trendy downtown neighborhood. It was the kind of place that screamed bachelor pad, all sleek lines, chrome fixtures, and impersonal modern art. It was a world away from the opulent, almost suffocating luxury of the penthouse she called home. This was his other life, the one he lived when he wasn't playing the part of the devoted husband. She stood before the door, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Her hand, when she raised it to knock, was trembling. This was it. The moment of ultimate humiliation, the final act in the twisted play he had orchestrated. She was here to apologize to his mistress, to beg for forgiveness for a crime she had not committed. The door was opened by the woman from the gala, the one with the sharp, predatory smile and the eyes that held a universe of contempt. She was dressed in a silk robe, her hair artfully disheveled, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her voice a low, triumphant purr. "Come in." She stepped into the apartment, her eyes taking in the details of the space. It was impeccably clean, almost sterile, with none of the personal touches that make a house a home. There was a half-empty bottle of champagne on the coffee table, 2 glasses beside it. A man's jacket, her husband's jacket, was slung carelessly over the back of a chair. The air was thick with the scent of his cologne, a scent she had once found intoxicating, but now only served as a sickening reminder of his betrayal. "He's not here," the woman said, as if reading her mind. "He had a meeting, but he told me to expect you." She led her to the living room, a space dominated by a large white leather sofa. She gestured for her to sit, then perched on the edge of the coffee table, her gaze unwavering, her smile a cruel, sharp line. "So," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I hear you have something to say to me." She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, had practiced the words until they were stripped of all emotion, a hollow, meaningless script. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, the words caught in her throat, a bitter, indigestible lump. I came to apologize," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, "for my behavior at the gala. It was inappropriate." The woman's smile widened. "Inappropriate?" she repeated, her voice a soft, dangerous caress. "Oh, I think it was more than inappropriate. I think it was pathetic. You, the perfect wife, the mother of his child, reduced to a jealous, hysterical mess. It was quite a show." She felt a surge of anger, a hot, fiery rage that threatened to consume her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to wipe the smug, triumphant look off the woman's face. But she couldn't. She had to play the part, to swallow her pride, to endure this humiliation for the sake of her child. "I was upset," she said, her voice still trembling. "I said things I shouldn't have said." "You're damn right you did," the woman said, her voice losing its soft, purring quality, replaced by a hard, sharp edge. "You have no idea what you've done, do you? You, with your perfect life and your perfect husband. You think you know him, but you don't know him at all." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into hers. "He doesn't love you," she said, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "He never has. You're just a means to an end, a way for him to produce an heir, to secure his legacy. You're a broodmare, nothing more." The words were like a physical blow. each one a sharp, stinging slap to her already bruised and battered heart. She had known, of course, that their marriage was a sham, a carefully constructed illusion of love and happiness, but to hear it spoken so bluntly, so cruelly, by the woman who had taken her place in his bed, was a pain unlike any she had ever known. "He's going to leave you," the woman continued, her voice relentless, merciless. "As soon as the baby is born, he's going to file for divorce. He's going to take the child, and you'll be left with nothing." "No," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, desperate plea. "He wouldn't do that, wouldn't he?" the woman said, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "You really are naive, aren't you? You have no idea the kind of man you're married to." She felt a sudden, sharp pain in her abdomen, a cramp so intense it took her breath away. She gasped, her hand flying to her swollen belly. The room began to spin, the edges of her vision blurring. "What's wrong?" the woman asked, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and annoyance. "Are you all right?" But she couldn't answer. The pain was getting worse, a wave of agony that washed over her, leaving her weak and breathless. She felt a trickle of warmth between her legs, and when she looked down, she saw a dark, spreading stain on the light-colored fabric of her dress. "Oh my God," the woman said, her eyes widening in horror. "You're bleeding." The world went black, the sound of the woman's frantic voice fading into a distant, muffled roar. The last thing she remembered before she lost consciousness was a single, terrifying thought. She was losing her baby. And it was all his fault. She woke up to the sterile, antiseptic smell of a hospital room. The light was dim, the air still and quiet, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. For a moment, she was disoriented, her mind a fog of confusion. Then, the memories came rushing back, a tidal wave of pain and fear. The confrontation with his mistress, the sharp, agonizing cramp, the terrifying sight of her own blood. A wave of panic washed over her, and she tried to sit up, her hand flying to her belly. It was still there, still swollen, a small, hard mound beneath the thin hospital blanket. A nurse bustled into the room, a kind-faced woman with warm, gentle eyes. "Easy now," the nurse said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You need to rest. You've been through a lot." "My baby," she whispered, her voice hoarse and raw. "Is my baby all right?" The nurse's smile was a beacon of hope in the darkness of her fear. "Your baby is fine," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "A little fighter, just like his mother. But you have to take it easy. You're at risk of a premature birth. You need to stay here, under observation, until the doctor says it's safe for you to go home." Relief washed over her. So potent, so overwhelming, it left her weak and trembling. Her baby was safe. Her baby was alive. Nothing else mattered. Her husband arrived a few hours later, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. He sat by her bedside, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her skin. He played the part of the devoted husband to perfection, his voice a low, comforting murmur as he spoke of his love, his worry, his relief that she and the baby were safe. But she was no longer fooled by his performance. She saw the lie in his eyes, the cold, calculating glint that betrayed his true emotions. He was not concerned for her well-being, but for the potential scandal that a sick, pregnant wife would create. He was not worried about their child, but about the heir to his fortune, the key to his legacy. "The doctor said you need to rest," he said, his voice laced with a false sincerity. "No stress, no excitement. Just peace and quiet." She looked at him, at the man who had caused her so much pain, who had pushed her to the brink of a physical and emotional breakdown, and she felt a cold, hard anger begin to smoulder in the pit of her stomach. He was the source of her stress, the architect of her misery. And now he was pretending to be her protector, her savior. "I want you to leave," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, his mask of concern slipping for a moment, revealing the cold, hard man beneath. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I said, I want you to leave," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. "I don't want you here. I don't want to see you." He stared at her, his eyes blazing with a cold, impotent fury. He was not used to being defied, to being told what to do. He was the one who gave the orders, the one who controlled every aspect of her life. But something had shifted between them. The balance of power had begun to tilt, and he was no longer in complete control. He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped and resentful. "If that's what you want." He turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight, his pride a fragile shield against the truth of their shattered marriage. He had left her alone, but she was not alone. She had her child, a tiny, precious life that was depending on her to be strong, to be brave, to fight for a better future. In the days that followed, she found a new sense of purpose, a clarity of mind that she hadn't felt in years. The hospital room became her sanctuary, a safe haven from the gilded cage she had called home. She had time to think, to plan, to strategize. She was no longer a victim, a pawn in her husband's twisted game. She was a survivor, a warrior, a mother who would stop at nothing to protect her child. She contacted the journalist again, this time from a burner phone she had managed to acquire with the help of a sympathetic nurse. She told her everything, the whole sordid story, from the encrypted emails to the forced apology, the physical abuse, the emotional blackmail. She had nothing left to lose, no reason to hold back. The journalist listened patiently, her voice a calm, steady presence on the other end of the line. When she had finished, there was a long silence, and for a moment, she was afraid that she had made a mistake, that she had trusted the wrong person. But then, the journalist spoke, her voice filled with a quiet, steely determination. "I believe you," she said. "And I'm going to help you. We're going to expose him for the monster he is. We're going to make sure he pays for what he's done." A wave of relief washed over her, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She was no longer alone in her fight. She had an ally, a powerful voice that would amplify her own, that would carry her story to the world. The storm was gathering, the clouds of her husband's downfall growing darker and more ominous with each passing day. The truth was a powerful weapon, and she was finally ready to wield it. The king's reign was coming to an end, and she would be the one to watch his kingdom crumble. The day she was discharged from the hospital, the city was abuzz with the news of her husband's impending downfall. The journalist had published her story, a sprawling, meticulously researched exposé that laid bare the full extent of his crimes. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a damning indictment of a man who had long been considered untouchable. The story was everywhere, on the front page of every newspaper, the lead story on every news channel. His face was plastered across the city, his name a byword for corruption and greed. The company he had built from the ground up was in freefall, its stock price plummeting, its investors panicking. The empire he had worked so hard to create was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. She watched the news from the safety of a hotel room, a small, anonymous space that felt more like home than the penthouse ever had. She had her post-nuptial agreement, a legally binding document that guaranteed her financial independence and full custody of her child. She was free, truly free, for the first time in years. Her husband tried to contact her, of course. He called, he texted, he sent a barrage of increasingly desperate emails. He begged, he pleaded, he threatened. He promised her the world, then threatened to take everything away. But his words were hollow, his threats empty. He had no power over her anymore. A few days later, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. It was the journalist, her voice tinged with a grim satisfaction. "He's been arrested," she said, her voice a low, triumphant murmur. "The police picked him up this morning. They're charging him with fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. The list goes on and on." A wave of emotions washed over her. Relief, vindication, a profound sense of sadness for the man she had once loved. He had brought this on himself, of course. He was the architect of his own destruction. But she couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for the broken, pathetic man he had become. "What about her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "His mistress?" the journalist asked. "She's been arrested too. Turns out she was more than just his lover. She was his accomplice, his partner in crime. They're going to throw the book at both of them." The news was a shock, but not a surprise. It made sense, in a twisted, dysfunctional way. They were two sides of the same corrupt coin, two souls drawn together by a shared darkness. The trial was a media circus, a spectacle of greed and betrayal that captivated the city for weeks. She was called to testify, to stand before a crowded courtroom and tell her story. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do, to lay bare the intimate details of her failed marriage, to relive the pain and humiliation he had inflicted upon her. But she did it. For her child, for herself, for every woman who had ever been made to feel small and weak and powerless. She spoke her truth, her voice clear and strong, her gaze unwavering. And as she spoke, she could feel the power shifting, the balance of justice finally tipping in her favor. Her husband sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of his former self. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. He looked at her with a mixture of hatred and despair, a man who had lost everything and had no one to blame but himself. His mistress was there too, her beauty faded, her predatory smile replaced by a look of sullen resentment. She glared at her with a venomous hatred, a woman who had gambled everything on a man who had nothing left to give. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, sentenced them both to the maximum prison term, a fitting end to their reign of corruption and deceit. As they were led away in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief, she felt a sense of closure, a finality that she had not expected. The storm had passed, the wreckage cleared, and she was left standing in the calm, quiet aftermath. She walked out of the courtroom and into the bright, warm sunlight, a free woman. She was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, no longer a victim of her husband's cruelty. She was a survivor, a warrior, a mother who had fought for her child's future and won. The road ahead would not be easy. She had a new life to build, a new future to create. But she was not afraid. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious. She was strong, she was resilient, she was free, and for the first time in a very long time, she was happy. The years that followed were a quiet, gentle unfolding of a life she had once only dreamed of. She moved to a small, coastal town, a place where the air was clean and the people were kind. She bought a modest house with a garden, a place where her son could run and play, where they could build a life free from the shadows of the past. Her son, a bright, curious boy with his mother's eyes and a spirit all his own, was the center of her universe. He was her reason for being, the living, breathing proof that she had made the right choice, that she had fought the good fight and won. She never spoke to him about his father, about the man who was serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison. What was there to say? How could she explain the darkness that had once consumed their lives, the greed and betrayal that had almost destroyed them? She would tell him, of course, when he was old enough to understand. But for now, she would protect him, shield him from the ugly truths of the world, and let him be a child, innocent and carefree. She rarely thought of her ex-husband or his mistress, who was also serving a long prison sentence. They were a part of her past, a chapter in her life that she had closed and put away. But sometimes, on a quiet, moonless night, when the wind was howling and the waves were crashing against the shore, she would remember. She would remember the gilded cage, the cold, empty eyes of the man she had once loved, the sharp, stinging pain of his betrayal. But the memories no longer had the power to hurt her. They were just ghosts, faint, shadowy figures from a life that was no longer her own. She had moved on, had built a new life, a new identity. She was no longer the millionaire's wife, the victim, the survivor. She was just a woman, a mother, a person who had found peace and happiness in the simple, ordinary moments of life. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, a thin, white envelope with a postmark from a federal prison. It was from him. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to burn it, to erase it from her life as she had erased him. But curiosity, a faint, flickering ember of what she had once felt for him, got the better of her. She opened the letter, her hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was his, the familiar, elegant script that she had once found so charming. But the words were not his. They were the words of a broken man, a man who had lost everything and had finally come to terms with the magnitude of his crimes. He apologized for everything, for the lies, the betrayal, the abuse. He asked for her forgiveness, not for his sake, but for hers. He wanted her to be free, truly free, from the anger and resentment that he knew she must still carry. She read the letter several times, the words blurring through a haze of tears. They were the words she had longed to hear for so long, the words she had thought she would never hear. And now, here they were, a peace offering from a man who had nothing left to give. She didn't know if she could forgive him. Some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too profound. But as she folded the letter and put it away, she felt a sense of release, a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She was free. She had been free for a long time, but now she was truly free. Free from the past, free from the anger, free from the man who had almost destroyed her. She walked out into her garden, the sun warm on her face, the scent of flowers in the air. Her son was there, chasing butterflies, his laughter a sweet, joyful sound that filled her heart to bursting. She watched him, a smile on her face, a tear in her eye. This was her life, her beautiful, precious, hard-won life. And it was more than enough. It was everything. So what would you have done if you were in her shoes? Would you have found the courage to expose the truth, even if it meant risking everything? Or would you have chosen to stay silent, to protect yourself and your child from the storm that was sure to follow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.